All right, this is now part 2 of the Continent of Asia walkthrough. Again, learn your country's capitals and then learn interesting geographical, political, historical, literary, artistic, musical things about them. But start basic, learn the capital, learn where it is, and then interesting things about it. So I've made my way through what we refer to as the Middle East and South Asia, and now we're moving on into China. So, last thing we were talking about in the previous edition was the independence of India and the partition of Pakistan and East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. Now we're going to move on into China, Southeast Asia, and Far East Japan, Korean Peninsula, and the like. So I'm going to start now, actually, up in the north and talk about Siberia. Siberia is the vast eastern part of Russia, not populated, incredibly cold, and essentially where during the time of the USSR, you would have had all of those various different gulags, those political prison camps stretched all along here. And as a matter of fact, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a Russian author, penned the Gulag Archipelago, talking about the sorts of things and the horrors of them all. But particularly, I want to talk about Lake Baikal that you can see here. There is more water in this lake than any other on Earth because of its just overwhelming depth. It is just tremendous. Comes up a lot in Quizbowl, does Lake Baikal, and definitely something that you should be familiar with. The Trans-Siberian Railroad was built all the way across until you finally get over to Vladivostok. You should know that place because that is the terminus of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Also, you have Kamchatka, the peninsula that is here, and thus the Sea of Okhotsk, and so forth and so on. But, oh well. All right, so let's then go down, and I'm going to be coming back to Sakhalin Island that you can see over here right above Japan. But we'll make our way down into Mongolia. Mongolia is dominated by the Gobi Desert, the Altai Mountains, and it is the least densely populated country on the world. Its capital is Ulaanbaatar, that you can see right here, and it is completely landlocked. And so around it you see Russia to the north, China to the south, and a little bit of Kazakhstan touching it right here. Then that leads us to China. China is an incredibly ancient country. A million things could I say about it, but we just do not have the time for it. But you have over here the plateau of Tibet. Tibet has its capital, Lhasa, and it is a region in China that is semi-autonomous. It wants to be autonomous at any rate, and it's where you get, of course, Tibetan Buddhism, which is led, I should say, by the Dalai Lama. Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama. But at any rate, over here as well, you have in this area of China the ethnic Uyghurs, a Muslim minority group that have been absolutely persecuted by the Chinese in all kinds of ways. They are put into camps, like concentration camps, to try and realign their views of the world and try to make them more like the dominant Han Chinese that, of course, are here. Briefly, the country of China is dominated by two rivers more than any other. That would be the northern Huanghe, also known as the Yellow River that is here, and of course the Yangtze. I forget which one, but one of the two is known as the Sorrows. And here you can see the Grand Canal, built many, many years ago, hundreds of years ago, that connect the two of them. The Yangtze, of course, comes and meets the ocean at Shanghai, one of the greatest cities of all of China, and a real economic mover, as it were. Nevertheless, you also have Wuhan, which is the site of the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Its first was seen there. And down to the south, and you don't have it listed, but the Pearl River comes out at Hong Kong. Hong Kong, in the late 90s, was granted back over control to China. In the late 19th century, the United Kingdom had essentially purchased a 100-year lease over Hong Kong, and thus it grew into one of the most economically prosperous and western cities on Earth. It, I think, has more skyscrapers per area than anywhere else on Earth. You have the Kowloon district that is there. But recently, and a lot of problems recently in Hong Kong, as the Chinese have tried to exert more and more influence upon it. It is essentially Hong Kong, an island city off of the mainland. But it is at the end of the Pearl River, and it has within it the, of course, Victoria Harbor, as well as many other things that I could say about it. Next to it, you have Macau, which makes Las Vegas as a gambling center look like small potatoes. Just absolutely tremendous infrastructure for being a gambling haven that you have there. Off to the east, you have, of course, Taiwan. Used to be known as Formosa, the Latin word that means shapely, as it were. And much in the same way that Sri Lanka down here in the bottom left used to be known as Ceylon. But at any rate, Taiwan, this is where the Kuomintang had escaped as the of course, communist forces led by Mao and the Long March. And China then says still that it is not an independent country, but the one China policy is to understand that Taiwan is a part. But much of the world recognizes its independence. And of course, you have as its capital Taipei. But at any rate, there's so many more things that we could say about China and all of its great history. But nevertheless, it would just take much too long. But do be familiar, go to you got to know these Chinese dynasties. But I guess a little bit of recent history. China is ruled over by Xi Jinping, but all you need is XI, Xi, as the answer. That's the one that comes up. He was consolidating power and has essentially become president for life. He also very much does not like it, the Chinese government, when you compare him to looking at Winnie the Pooh, because he kind of looks like Winnie the Pooh. And there's another picture that you have with him walking along with Obama, and Obama is compared to the cat Tigger. And so it is actually illegal. They disallow it in China of portraying Xi as Winnie the Pooh. Other people that you should know as well, you have, of course, the 20th century leader Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, and so many things to know about him, including the 100 Flowers campaign, Great Leaps Forward, all kinds of things that you should be familiar with. And then, of course, following Mao, you have Deng Xiaoping, as well as others. So quickly going through Wikipedia, you could catch up on recent Chinese leaders all the way up into the incredibly important now Xi Jinping, as it were. So again, so many more things that we could say. Capital China, obviously, is at Beijing. Just briefly, 1989, and I think this was during Deng Xiaoping, but nevertheless, I could be wrong on that. But you have the Tiananmen Square massacre, in which pro-democracy students protested. That's where you get Tank Man standing in front of the tanks. In Tiananmen Square, they built a giant statue to the goddess democracy, and that kind of stuff comes up quite a bit in Quizbowl, as it were. Now, let's move to the Korean Peninsula. And divided since the Korean War of the early 1950s. Lots of things that you could say about the Korean War. Incheon, that is there, comes up as a clue often. Of course, North Korea is dominated by the Kim family. Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-un. But nevertheless, quickly go make a brief reading about the 20th century North Koreans, and its capital is Pyongyang. South Korea, which is a rather developed economy, rather advanced, with its capital of Seoul, has its own issues as well from the Korean War. So make sure that you are able to take some time and go and look up about the North Korean leaders from Kim Jong-un currently, only 3 generations back, to the founder of North Korea, communist government, incredibly repressive government. And the same thing with South Korea. They've been in the news quite a bit. Go and Control F South Korea and other items in the PDF files that we have in AQT questions, as well as QB Reader. Then we have, of course, Japan. You got to know these indigenous peoples. Talks about the Ainu people up here in the north, as it were, of the country. You have the Russo-Japanese War that takes place in the early 20th century, for which Teddy Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for brokering. It's is Japan, divided into several islands. Make sure you know your islands. There are 4 main ones that you should know. Right to the north are the Kuril Islands and Sakhalin Island, which at one point was disputed. But you have Hokkaido with Sapporo. You have Honshu, which is where you find Tokyo, used to be known as Edo. And then you have, of course, Shikoku, and then Kyushu. Memorize those 4 islands. And, of course, the biggest one is that of Honshu. Lots and lots of things we could talk about. Mount Fuji, the great artist of the 19th century Hokusai with his 36 views of Mount Fuji, including the Great Wave off Kanagawa. Kyoto Accords. Osaka is an important place. Hiroshima, obviously, as being one of the site of the atomic bomb. The great Fukushima accident after an earthquake at a nuclear plant, as it were. But just so much stuff that comes up in Quizbowl concerning Japan. Hirohito with the Jewel Voice broadcast, saying that the Japanese were surrendering at the end of World War II, saying that his people had to endure the unendurable. But just so much stuff that can come up and does come up concerning Japan. Just a rich answer source for lots of things. Right to the south of Japan comes up often is the Ryukyu Islands as a part, and of course Okinawa, which is the site of an incredibly important and famous battle in World War II, with Japan being one of the, of course, combatants against the United States. In between the Korean Peninsula and mainland China, you have, of course, the Yellow Sea. And then, of course, to the east of Shanghai, you have the East China Sea, and then, of course, the South China Sea, and all kinds of problems in all of these areas with disputes between China and its neighbors and the like. We move on to the Philippines in the interest of time, although there could be so much more that we could say about Japan. The Philippines is on an island country as well. Its 2 main islands are the islands of Luzon, which is the one that you have here. There you can see Luzon, and of course Mindanao, which is that southern island is there. Make sure you know those 2. The capital is, of course, Manila, outside of which is the very first Chinatown, as it were, in that Chinese merchants would come and set up, and those people in the age of exploration in the 1500s bringing silver from South America set up outside right there. The recent history of the Philippines includes Duterte, who, of course, carried out a ruthless war on drugs with lots of extrajudicial killings. He had been previously a mayor of one of the cities. I don't know which one particularly. Also, it is the site of the Bataan Death March of World War II in the Bataan Peninsula. And it as well is an incredibly important country in the history of the United States, as it was controlled originally by Spain in the age of colonialism, and then taken over by the United States following the Spanish-American War at the turn of the 20th century. But an incredibly important city, or I should say place as well. In the 1980s, there was a ruler over the Philippines known as Marcos, and I just remember it being in the news, as it were, and I think Marcos was replaced by Corazon Aquino, a woman ruler, prime minister of some sort. Is that Marcos's wife, Imelda Marcos, was noted for having like so many shoes, like thousands and thousands of shoes. You should go look it up. It's kind of funny and interesting, as it were, at the same time. But at any rate, and here you have Leyte, which is the site of a battle known as Leyte Gulf. So be familiar with Luzon, Manila, and, of course, Mindanao is the southern city with Davao. I think he might have been, Duterte, was he the governor, or not governor, but mayor of Davao? I can't remember which one. But he, of course, is no longer the ruler, as it were. So let's go in the South China Sea over here to Southeast Asia and talk about these countries very briefly. So you have Myanmar, which is Burma, as it were, and it no longer has the capital of Yangon, but Naypyidaw, that you can see there, Naypyidaw, as it were. The Irrawaddy River is the dominating river of Myanmar or Burma, so important to know that. You then move over to, and somewhere down here, I am embarrassed that I do not know, but you have, unfortunately, the Rohingya people, who are really a people without a country and are being absolutely persecuted in many ways. And I don't know exactly I can't remember exactly where it is, but I want to say it is Burma or somewhere therein. Close, as it were. I think we actually skipped Bhutan with its capital of Thimphu. Bhutan is a unique country that it has the National Happiness Index. Instead of measuring economic advancement and the like, they, of course, try to encourage happiness as a concept within the country. You then have here Thailand, which was known earlier as Siam. That's where you have the musical The King and I, the King of Siam, as it were. But now it's known as Thailand, with its capital of Bangkok. And Thailand takes part of the, of course, peninsula that is here, known as the Malay Peninsula. That also includes, does it share with Malaysia that is here. At any rate, Thailand, you should know all about its king, and just go look it up and make sure that you're familiar with it, at least in some ways, and how it comes up. You have Laos with its capital of Vientiane. And just like the Irrawaddy is so important in Burma, for all of these countries, you have the Mekong. The Mekong is incredibly important. It's famous for, obviously, a large species of catfish that grow there. But you have Laos with Vientiane. You have Vietnam, which is, of course, right here, and Cambodia. Please note that Vietnam, obviously, was the place where we were fighting in the 1960s and 70s in the Vietnam War. It all started for the United States in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin, but it had gone back years and years before due to the fact that this was dominated by French and the French colonials. 1954, you have a battle known as Dien Bien Phu, in which General Giap essentially wipes out forces of the French. Everything I bring up because it has come up quite a bit in Quizbowl, and so you should make note of it. Pause the video and go and look it up or something of that nature. But capital of Vietnam is Hanoi, and down here used to be, for South Vietnam, Saigon, but now renamed Ho Chi Minh City. So, of course, all kinds of things to know about the Vietnam War as it comes up. Tim O'Brien and his work called The Things They Carried is about his experience, a set of short stories. Operation Rolling Thunder, the Tet Offensive, the list goes on and on. A very rich answer source, Vietnam War, and all of that comes along with it. Cambodia, also known as Kampuchea, it is the home of the 1970s Khmer Rouge and the killing fields in which Pol Pot, that dictator, came to power and was indeed a butcher of his own people in those killing fields. And again, it was the Khmer Rouge. It is also the place where you'll find Angkor Wat, a huge religious complex with its capital here of Cambodia, Phnom Penh. Moving down on the Malay Peninsula, you have Malaysia with its capital of Kuala Lumpur. That is where you find the Petronas Towers. Petronas is an oil company in Malaysia, and indeed it is responsible for building those huge towers, which in the late 90s, for a time, were the tallest in the world. At the end of the Malay Peninsula, you find the city-state. It's a singular city, but it is that of Singapore. Now, Malaysia has its country located on both the Malay Peninsula and, of course, the island of Borneo, one of the largest islands in the world. And also on Borneo, you find Brunei, a sultanate with its capital Bandar Seri Begawan. Then Indonesia, hugely important, fourth largest country on Earth, comprised of thousands of little islands. But the main islands that you need to be familiar with includes that of Sumatra, the most populous island in the world, that being Java, that is right here, that has the capital Jakarta. The recent history of Indonesia is easily learned with Suharto and Sukarno. Go and look them up and see how often they come up in Quizbowl. This little island of Bali, which is a tourist destination that you have that is there. Indonesia not only is the fourth largest country in the world, it has only recently been passed by Pakistan for having the most Muslims on Earth. So stretched out all along here in Indonesia, it is also the site of a lot of volcanic activity. It is where you have Mount Tambora that erupted, as well as Mount Krakatoa. Krakatoa in 1883, I want to say. Just absolutely one of the greatest volcanic eruptions in all of human recorded history. You also have in this area, particularly of Sumatra, the, of course, horrors of the Indian Ocean tsunami that occurred right at Christmas in 2006, in which hundreds of thousands of people were wiped out. I remember it quite distinctly. Be familiar with these various different straits. I forget which one. I think it might be this one, the Straits of Malacca, as so much of the commerce of the world goes through them and the like. And of course, to the eastern end of the country Indonesia, you have the separatist state that is now independent, Timor-Leste, or as it's called, East Timor, if you would like, with its capital of Dili, as it were. Then finally, we're ending up with the island of New Guinea. Again, also along with Borneo, another one of the largest of the world. But on New Guinea, you have half of it a part Indonesia, and the other half the country Papua New Guinea, as it were. So be familiar as much as you can with a lot of this stuff. A lot of the stuff I'm leaving out, like, for example, a lake that is incredibly famous, Tonle Sap, comes up a lot with the various countries they have here. But systematically, go through it. And you will find that if you go and take it one country at a time, you will over time be able to build up all kinds of knowledge and be able to get things correct. So Sumatra and Java, and then all of the other islands, including Borneo and New Guinea, as well as all these hundreds of islands that are in here for Indonesia. And I think that's where we're going to end up for this installment of Asia. Again, I've left out so much as I'm just trying to give you an overview as to where things are and why they're important and what comes up in Quizbowl. Thanks for listening and or watching if you were, and hopefully you will get better as a player.